we got it packed up. All right, so what's the title? You're a hard-headed Negro. When race changed sight in America, that's fine. Yeah. Yeah, when race changed sight. I think it's good. My job as uncle was just, riffing. And she kept going, nope. She kept saying, in case you didn't hear me, motherfucker.
Hello, everyone. Hello.
Hello.
And welcome to today's colloquium.
Thank you.
We're excited for the presentation by Britt, our wonderful fellow, and she will be introduced by Sarah Elizabeth Lewis. And it is also my pleasure to introduce Sarah Lewis, the distinguished Sarah Lewis, and also an alum fellow. She is the Loeb Associate Professor of the Humanities and Associate Professor of African and African-American Studies here at Harvard, a much-acclaimed art and cultural historian. She is the founder of Vision and Justice, a civic initiative that generates original research, curricula, and programs that reveal the foundational role visual culture plays in generating equity and justice in America. Professor Lewis's research focuses on the intersection of visual representation, racial justice, and democracy in the U.S. from the 19th century through the present. Her many award-winning publications include The Rise, Carrie Mae Weems, and Vision and Justice by Aperture magazine. Her recent and forthcoming publications include How Race Changed Sight in America, Vision and Justice, and Groundwork, Race and Aesthetics in the Era of Stand Your Ground Law. Please welcome Sarah Lewis.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you. I want to just mention from the start, this is not hyperbole. I have been waiting for this presentation for over 10 years, and I'll tell you why. Here in this room, we held a gathering, a symposium to honor the mission of the Cooper Gallery. And there we were thinking through the early foundations of African diasporic art in the United States. And I was thrilled to be able to present on a topic that was little known to many, William J. Wilson's Afric-American Picture Gallery. This is a periodical series, experimental, in which you hear this extraordinary writer imagine what a museum dedicated to Black art in the United States could look like. He takes on this guise and this persona, walking us through these imagined galleries and offering send-ups of what's not in American galleries in that period in the 1850s. At the time I was writing my dissertation, and I thought, who's going to come along and write the book on this extraordinary project? Having just finished my own and knowing, as we all do, that some books are given to others, I knew it wasn't my project. And I'm so thrilled that the project does belong to the great Britt Rusert, who's presenting on it today. She comes so well equipped to focus on this material, not merely because she is the now full professor as of last year. Yeah. Of African, that's right. Of African-American Literature and Culture in the W.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies at UMass Amherst. She has material that's also been supported that she'll present on today here by the ACLS Fellowship and the NEH. But she has published on work that gives her a unique vantage point on the importance of this understudied project in having published not just Fugitive Science, the great book on empiricism and freedom in early African-American culture, but W.B. Du Bois's Data Portraits, a book that looked at this groundbreaking project and study that he and his students at Atlanta University put on display in the 1900 Paris Exposition. So now you know why I'm thrilled to be able to, after 10 years, hear from Britt Rusert. And now you also know why I'm very sorry that I do have to teach at 1:30, so I'll be leaving a bit early, but it's not because of lack of enthusiasm. It is just my pleasure to introduce Britt Rusert today. Thank you.
I can see you there. Thank you, Sarah, for that lovely introduction and for agreeing to do this on a busy teaching day. I so appreciate it. I also want to thank the Hutchins Center staff, the Skip and Abby and Krishna, the tech staff, everybody for all the work that you do to support the fellows. This has just been an incredible year so far, and it has been such a joy to be able to write and to think every week in this community of scholars. It's just been incredible. So my goal here today is to introduce you to a figure and a text with which I have been fascinated for the better part of the last 10 years. This figure is William J. Wilson, an African-American educator, activist, and writer who lived and worked in Brooklyn in the 1840s and 1850s. William J. Wilson may have also been, feel free to move if you need to be able to see this screen. So William J. Wilson was active in Brooklyn in the 1840s and the 1850s. He may have also been New York City's first Black culture critic. A self-stylized flaneur, cultural aesthete, and frequent contributor to Black antebellum periodicals, he wrote under the name Ethiop and as the Brooklyn correspondent for Frederick Douglass's paper. In these columns, he provided readers across the nation with on-the-ground reports of New York's people, places, and happenings based on his frequent ramblings around the city, and that's what he often referred to these walks as ramblings. Wilson was especially interested in the sights and sounds of Broadway as it emerged as a hub of culture, entertainment, and conspicuous consumption in the middle of the 19th century. And here is a stereoscopic view of Broadway in 1859, a year that is crucial to my thinking for this project. Based on his columns, it's clear that Wilson was a frequent promenader on Broadway, interested in seeing and being seen in a world increasingly defined by mass spectacle, commodification, and consumerism. Wilson was also deeply concerned with the politics of representation, I would argue at least as much as Frederick Douglass was. And perhaps more so than any other commentator of his era, Wilson was specifically interested in the question of racial representation within the sphere of fine art. For example, writing to Frederick Douglass's paper in March 1853, he wrote on the glaring absence of what he called distinguished Black figures in museums and galleries. He concluded, "We must begin to tell our own story, write our own lecture, paint our own picture, chisel our own bust." A few years later, in 1859, Wilson would fulfill his own call for a gallery of distinguished Black portraits with his publication of the Afric-American Picture Gallery, an experimental text that essentially imagines the first museum of Black art in the United States. So as Sarah mentioned, I'm currently working on a monograph on Wilson, his world, and his picture gallery. This work also builds on a digital project on the picture gallery that I designed with my colleague Leif Ekstrom for the American Antiquarian Society's Just Teach One initiative. I learned from Alexandria how to put a QR code on a slide, and I thought that was such a great idea last semester. I thought I would do it for you all here, so thanks, Alexandria. So I thought I would share this project, this digital project for you that we built in 2015, in case you'd like to read the full text of the picture gallery. It's an OCR, scanned, edited, fully annotated edition that's available there. We also have included an introduction to the text, images, and teaching resources, including reflections from some of our colleagues who have taught this work in their classes. Inspired by the picture gallery's own ambitious flights of speculation, my book's chapters take an experimental approach, spinning out a number of artistic, philosophical encounters, rather than producing a more traditional literary history of the text and its author. This is a really wild text, and I was writing a pretty traditional literary history, and at a certain point I decided to kind of blow it all up and start over, sort of inspired by Wilson's own writing. So 2 chapters place Wilson in relation to 2 unlikely interlocutors from different time periods, Phyllis Wheatley and then Walter Benjamin. A 3rd chapter situates the picture gallery within a vibrant 19th century sketch tradition in order to define the contours of what I'm theorizing as a distinctly late antebellum Black aesthetics. A final chapter turns to the epic Black forest fantasy tale that comes to preoccupy the text, transforming the series from an ordered gallery tour to a work of speculative fiction. And in that part of the text, Wilson is clearly influenced by Grimm's fairy tales. In between chapters in the manuscript, I asked readers to take an imaginative stroll through the holdings of the picture gallery. This section of my book, split into 3 interludes and interleaved between chapters, is offered as an experiment in narrative, inspired by the fact that the picture gallery's own critical reflections are grounded in the format of a gallery tour. Wilson was writing during a time that witnessed the rise of modern art criticism, and this genre shaped both the themes and format of the Afric-American picture gallery. More specifically, Ethiop's gallery tour draws from the conventions of the periodical art review, in which correspondents would offer readers reflections and assessments of a particular exhibition or a notable work on display in a museum, fair, or other venue. 19th century art reviews also contained their own ekphrastic, or written descriptions of works of fine art, which were especially valuable for readers in an age before images could be quickly circulated through mass media, and when travel for the purposes of absorbing fine art and culture was a luxury only accessible to the very wealthy. Because of high costs and issues with access to print and visual technologies, this was a time when images were rare in the African-American print sphere. For example, in the Anglo-African magazine, this is the publication where the picture gallery appeared, only 2 images were reproduced in its 2-year run. This portrait of Alexandre Dumas and this engraving that I love of Ira Eldridge, the New York-born Shakespearean actor, depicted here as Aaron from Titus. And both of these images appeared only in the bound annuals of the magazine. So if you were subscribing and getting the magazine every month, no images. So these two images appeared in the bound annuals of the magazine and were advertised as special embellishments for subscribers. So this is a time when pictures, actual pictures, were rare and very special in the Black print sphere. So today I'd like to do 2 things. I want to spend a little bit of time giving you some background to Wilson's life and work based on census data and some archival research I've been engaged in over the past few years. After that, I want to turn to the text of the picture gallery itself. And to do so, I will offer 3 vignettes focused on objects in Wilson's gallery. A painting of a slave ship anchored near the shores of colonial Jamestown. Then I'll talk a little bit about a portrait of Crispus Attucks, and I'll finish with a portrait of Phyllis Wheatley. And here I'm excited to be extending the rich conversation about Wheatley that has just sort of emerged organically this year at the Hutchins Center. Okay, so from the outset, Sarah actually already mentioned this, and I'm so happy to be able to reiterate it because I think it's such an important thing to understand about this text. So there are two curiosities that I want to mention about the Afric-American Picture Gallery. First, are you ready? This is a deeply visually attuned text that reproduces no actual pictures. Is that clear? Okay, good. So instead, Wilson's descriptions are ekphrastic, or written descriptions of art. Second, Wilson took the pen name that he wrote under in the periodical sphere. He wrote, it was a correspondent writing as Ethiop, and he transformed Ethiop into a fully developed literary character for this text, for the picture gallery. So Ethiop serves as the text narrator and also as a kind of docent who guides readers through this imaginary collection of portraits, landscapes, sketches, and prints. In other words, Wilson essentially drops a fictional avatar of himself into the picture gallery. I think this act of fictionalization is really fascinating, and I've been trying to think about it as being part of a broader phenomenon in Black writing in this kind of micro period that interests me right before the Civil War. For example, in another text published in 1859 and rediscovered by Skip Gates in 1981, Harriet Wilson would protect her identity and story through the avatar of Fredo. And of course, in 1861, Harriet Jacobs would use Linda Brent as a cover meant to protect her identity as a fugitive and to protect her own vulnerability as a woman who had experienced relentless forms of sexual abuse as an enslaved girl and young woman. Okay, so back to the picture gallery. The Afric-American Picture Gallery appeared in 7 installments in the Anglo-African magazine. And the Anglo-African magazine was a Black vanguard periodical that was published in New York City by the printer, editor, and bookseller Thomas Hamilton. I often talk to my students about the Anglo-African as a kind of like 19th century Black New Yorker. It was like this vanguard publication. It included a range of writings, including poetry, short stories, political essays, and more polemical tracts. Thomas Hamilton and William J. Wilson were both members of a tight-knit coterie of African-American cultural elites and intellectuals who lived and worked in late antebellum New York. This network of Black New Yorkers stylized themselves as cosmopolitans and sometimes as bohemians. Deeply learned, well-versed in art and culture, this class included entrepreneurs, clergy, and people like James McCune Smith, who had gone abroad to study medicine before returning home to practice. Many of these families could also trace their free status back to the Revolutionary era, and they did so with pride. Although biographical data on Wilson are scant, some details about his life can be stitched together from periodicals, census data, and records of political organizations in the period. Wilson's own periodical correspondence offers some additional insight into his life and milieu. We know that he migrated to Brooklyn sometime in the 1830s or early 1840s, following the regional movement of many African Americans into the city in this period. Born in or around 1818 in the state of New Jersey, Wilson can be found in Brooklyn city directories beginning in 1842. That year, he was appointed principal of Brooklyn's Colored School No. 1, one of 3 schools for Black students in the city. Wilson's wife, Mary, was born in New York, and she also taught at the school and served for a short time as principal of its primary department. William and Mary had one daughter, a girl they named Anne and called Annie. Wilson was a dedicated educational advocate. He also participated in the movement to extend New York's franchise to African American men. He served as a delegate to the 1855 Colored Convention in Philadelphia, and he was a member of the Committee of 13, an anti-colonization group that formed in the wake of the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850. Marking himself as a quintessential Brooklynite, Wilson was not shy about his belief that Brooklyn was superior to the rest of New York. I'm not trying to throw any shade to current people, but he was already doing this a long time ago. So in his first column is Frederick Douglass's paper's Brooklyn correspondent. I didn't know that was going to get such a reaction. That's great. Okay, so he wrote in Frederick Douglass's paper, "New York is a great city. When I say New York, I of course include its environs. New York proper may be considered the body, of which the adjacent towns around it are the limbs or members thereof. Brooklyn, from its quietness, serenity, morality, and intellectuality, may be regarded the head." So he says Brooklyn is the head of New York. Here, Wilson seeks to draw attention to Brooklyn's growing status mid-century, portraying it as New York's intellectual and moral head, and also as the city's center of culture. So city directories and atlases show Wilson and his family living at a number of different addresses in Brooklyn in the 1840s and 1850s, including residences on Chapel Street, Nassau, and Atlantic. His residence here on Nassau places Wilson around the corner from Duffield Street, a famous street of Black abolitionist activity that included homes of activists who were known to shelter fugitive slaves. We can also locate Wilson in Manhattan. His newspaper columns often find him strolling on Broadway, and we can also place him in close proximity to the historic free Black community in Lower Manhattan that Carla Peterson traces in great detail in her beautiful book, Black Gotham, which includes research on her own ancestors in New York City. Thomas Hamilton published his Anglo-African magazine on Bleecker Street, which you can see here, and in that same historic Black neighborhood and just 2 blocks from New York's Printing House Square. In some ways, it feels strange to try to pin down Wilson's coordinates, which is part of what I'm trying to do for this project is to present at least a beginning biography of Wilson and his family. But at times has felt a bit strange, given Wilson's interest in strolling and rambling, his interest in wayward movement in the city streets as a form of freedom. For example, in a short story Wilson published in 1854, entitled Terence Ludlam, Wilson's narrator recounts a recent trip he took to a village north of Brooklyn. Setting out on this journey, the narrator says that, quote, "The pleasure of the undertaking lies in the absence of any arrangement how or where to go, time and liberty being the only requisites." So this kind of like aimless wandering, strolling, flaneuring gave Wilson's narrator occasion to comment on a changing industrialized landscape based on his own observations walking on the ground. So we're often getting, just all these kinds of observations, like both about like structural changes and things happening on the city streets from his perspective as a walker or a rambler. Recalling a familiar language of queer movement and practice beginning in the 20th century, Wilson's narrator refers to this retreat upstate as a country cruise. When I came across this, just given his interest in like dress and like banter and just his style and kind of flair for opulence, when I saw in this story that he calls his walking a country cruise, I thought, well, that's really interesting. So I think given Wilson's sardonic wit, his dandyism, his interest in dragging and reading his closest friends in print, we might also place Wilson's writings within the beginnings of a Black queer aesthetic that is often dated to the new Negro Renaissance, but I think that we can really start to see emerging in this earlier moment right before the Civil War in the late 1850s. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit here about photography. Wilson's picture gallery also registers how the city was being transformed by photography. By the late 1850s, Wilson's beloved Broadway was lined with daguerreotype studios. In these establishments, non-elite Americans could, for the first time in history, sit to have their portrait taken. As I think as everyone in this room already knows, Frederick Douglass was himself an enthusiastic proponent of photography because of its democratic potential. It's tempting to think of Wilson himself sitting for his portrait in a Broadway studio. But of course, such establishments were subject to the same forms of de facto racial segregation and exclusion that marked the entire city in this period. Even though I haven't yet found a daguerreotype of Wilson, I have to believe, given his enthusiasm for all things on Broadway, that he had his portrait taken. Other members of Wilson's coterie did so, and some became photographers themselves. For example, the educator, emigrationist, and photographer Augustus Washington circulated in Wilson's social networks. In fact, Wilson replaced Washington as the principal of Colored School No. 1 after he left the position to move to Hartford to open up his own daguerreotype studio. An ad for that studio is on your left here. In 1853, Washington would leave the U.S. with thousands of other African Americans bound for resettlement in Liberia. Washington would set up another daguerreotype studio in Monrovia. So this is all just to say, Wilson was living and working in a world increasingly defined by photography, and he was circulating among other photographers. So earlier I noted, and I made sure everyone nodded so they understood this key part about the picture gallery is that it reproduces no actual pictures. So here's another paradox. The picture gallery suppresses photography as a signifier at the same time as it feels deeply shaped by the rise of this technology and its transformation of the visual field. Does that make sense? It feels like photography's everywhere, even though he doesn't mention anything about it. Ethiop's ekphrastic descriptions often feel like panoramic views that get shuttered and get turned into a picture, right? He's also really focused on lighting, and I have to believe that this was also part of photography's influence on Wilson's writing. So even though Wilson does not mention a daguerreotype in his gallery, photography's presence can be felt everywhere. It's also the case that daguerrean studios doubled as informal gallery spaces where patrons could view portraits, landscapes, and other works while they waited for their portraits to develop. So in other words, photography studios were often also picture galleries. This is an illustration of James Presley Ball's studio in Cincinnati, and you can see landscapes, you can see landscapes and also sculptural busts alongside daguerreotypes lining the walls. You see those up there, so above the portraits. Ball was an early and influential African-American photographer, and his sitters included Black patrons. It's thus striking that in this illustration, we can only see white viewers in this gallery. And I think this is one of the most important gestures of Wilson's picture gallery. It visualizes not just Black art, but it also intentionally centers Black viewers within the gallery space. This particular copy of Ball's pamphlet is held here at the Houghton, and I was really struck the first time I saw it that there's a kind of, do you see that all the viewers, I think, are white viewers in the gallery space, but there's one kind of accidental beheading of one viewer through the tear of the paper in the center. Do you see that there? And I just thought that was a kind of interesting sort of historical accident. So Ball's splendid Mammoth pictorial tour was published in 1855, and in it, Ball gives a textual tour of his traveling panorama, which likely included paintings by the African-American landscape artist Robert Duncanson, who worked for a time in Ball's studio. I think everyone who went to Skip and Sarah's exhibition already has some background in J.P. Ball and in some of these contexts that I'm laying out here. So I have personally wondered if Wilson visited Ball's Mammoth pictorial tour when it toured the Northeast, and I have also wondered if this pamphlet, which is itself a textual tour of a kind of gallery, right, of this panorama, I've wondered if it helped to inspire Wilson's own picture gallery. More broadly, I have been thinking a lot lately about the capaciousness of the picture, of that term picture, both in Wilson's gallery and in this transitional moment in the 1850s, before the term picture became linguistically narrowed down to mean a photograph. In Wilson's text, a picture can signify many different things, and is a site of proliferating signification and open possibility. Sketch has a similarly capacious meaning in the gallery and is a site of much play throughout the text. For example, Ethiop presents his own descriptions as sketches, often playing on the idea that a sketch can be a piece of writing or a work of art, both done quickly on paper. Okay, one final thing before I get to the actual objects in the gallery. Sometimes when I talk about this project, I feel like I'm trying to lay out all of these contexts and being responsible, and I forget one important thing. It's a really funny text. Wilson was hilarious. He was really funny and really hilarious, so I just want to say that before I get into some of the objects here. Okay, so now here's my little mini gallery tour. And this is my first time trying this. It's a little bit of an experiment, so I hope you'll bear with me. So, upon entering the Afric-American Picture Gallery, visitors are immediately confronted with a painting of a slave ship. Hung near the museum's entrance, Wilson infuses his description of the piece's location and lighting with his characteristic wit. A nod to geographies of enslavement in the antebellum South, he says that the painting hangs on the, quote, south side of the gallery. Hinting at the horrors of the slave trade and perhaps also at abolition's increasing success at swaying public opinion, he goes on to say that the painting appears in, quote, rather an unfavorable light. The slave ship became central to the visual propaganda of abolition in the late 18th century. In 1788, the British abolitionist Thomas Clarkson, together with the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, published a broadside depicting the plan of the Brooks, a slave ship that was outfitted and launched from Liverpool beginning in 1782. This image of the Brooks would quickly become central to the anti-slavery visual imagination. Drawing power from its precision, the blueprint image included dimensions of the ship and depicted hundreds of captives tightly packed into the hold, which you can see here in the background of the slide. The image of the Brooks slave ship was reproduced widely and became an iconic image reflecting the inhumanity of the slave trade, part and parcel of a world of commodities and trade built on the traffic in human beings. It also served as powerful evidence in the court case that led to England's abolition of the slave trade in 1807. This image would continue to occupy a central location in the abolitionist imaginary into the 19th century, including in the United States. But here, in picture number 1, Wilson doesn't seem to be citing the mathematical and architectural hold of the Brooks broadside, as much as he references a tradition of visualizing the slave ship through a romantic aesthetics of sublimity, awe, and terror. The most obvious citation here is J.M.W. Turner's 1840 painting of the 1781 Song Massacre. I just wanted to mention in his recent novel, Teju Cole tells a really fascinating story about the Baroque provenance of this painting, which I thought was really fascinating and you might want to check out. And this painting also today hangs on the walls of Boston's MFA, so we can all go and see it after a long history of it being held privately. So like many objects in the picture gallery, Wilson's slave ship deploys the Gothic to portray a nation degraded by slavery's influence. This ship, Ethiop notes, is, quote, Dutch-modeled and ugly, even hideous to look upon, as a slave ship ought to be. Next, we learn that the painting depicts the first group of captive Africans forced onto the shores of an American colony. Quote, the shore is a group of emaciated Africans, heavily manacled, the first slaves that ever trod the American continent. Ethiop next draws the mind's eye back to the, quote, fierce and angry waters of the bay, where we see, quote, a small boat containing another lot of these human beings, just nearing the shore. Ethiop's description, zooming out from the shore to the bay, suggests a procession and a horrifying cycle. Africans on shore, heavy with chains, are followed by the transport of more captive souls by boat, to be followed by more ships, more boats, more humans pushed into bondage. But then from there, Ethiop zooms back in, forcing us to confront the Africans in chains in their individuality rather than as a depersonalized mass, of which the original Brooks image was guilty. Ethiop says that the, quote, death-like faces of the captives are the painting's, quote, crowning point. I think that Roland Barthes would refer to this crowning point as the painting's punctum. Through his installment of an ominous image of the beginnings of the slave trade on North American shores, Wilson presents slavery as an undeniable and haunting presence, not just in American history, but also in American art. Indeed, one might say that by beginning his gallery tour this way and hanging this piece at the gallery's entrance, Ethiop positions the slave trade as the frame through which everything that follows must be interpreted, the painting's frame as the door of no return. More broadly, Ethiop participates in and helps to inaugurate a long tradition of visualizing the slave ship in Afro-diasporic art. Okay. Continuing on the north side of the gallery, we next find ourselves in front of a portrait of Crispus Attucks, the sailor and whaler of Black and Indigenous descent, generally regarded as the first person killed in the Revolutionary War. Attucks was one of the sailors, stevedores, dock workers, and other members of Boston's multiracial working class, who on March 5th, 1770, faced off, are we there? We're almost there, a couple days, faced off with British soldiers in front of the Boston Customs House in what would become known as the Boston Massacre. Wilson's decision to install a, quote, head of Attucks in the picture gallery is connected to the author's interest in the politics of race and American republicanism throughout the picture gallery. It's also connected to a complex and racially charged history of visual representation of the massacre itself. This, I might be rehearsing a history that you already know, but in 1770, Paul Revere engraved and distributed a print of the massacre scene after an image created by the Boston artist Henry Pelham. Henry Pelham's engraving is on your left, Revere's is on your right, and famously, Pelham had no idea how Revere got a hold of this image and was really pissed off that he scooped him. So Revere's graphic took many creative liberties. For one, he split the American crowd in the British sentries into two sides, a projective fantasy of organized battle that both ignored the actual chaos of the event. In reality, colonists hurled snowballs at the British guards, and they in turn shot their muskets into a crowd of hundreds. In the Revere engraving, the killing of Attucks is also ambiguously represented. Some copies of the print used brown ink to show a man of color with chest wounds, others did not. The figure who may represent Attucks is also decentered visually in Revere's print, appearing within the crowd rather than on the front lines of the confrontation. Either way, the Revere print does not prioritize Attucks as a leader or as a martyr of the American Revolution. In the 19th century, visual depictions of the Boston Massacre shifted in ways that tracked alongside changing political cultures and the strengthening of the abolitionist movement. For example, an 1856 lithograph restored Attucks' prominent role in sacrifice in the bloody confrontation. Working from the Revere print, this adaptation brings Attucks to the center of the scene. I love this image. I was really glad you all chose it for my flyer. The lithograph emphasizes Attucks' blackness as well as his militant agency. He holds a club in one hand and the end of the bayonet in the other, usurping control of a historical and visual narrative that had marginalized him. By the late 1850s, Attucks had become a crucial icon and hero of the abolition movement. For Black abolitionists especially, Attucks was a symbol of courage and sacrifice for the nation's war against tyranny. In 1855, William C. Nell published The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, a sweeping history of Black patriots and their heroism during the American wars against the British in both 1776 and 1812. Nell was himself the son of a Black Revolutionary War soldier. The book opens with a rousing account of Attucks' sacrifice and martyrdom for the American cause, and an engraving of Attucks is prominently featured. Nells's illustration shows Attucks laying on the ground in the center of the battle scene rather than standing upright, as in the 1856. Do you see the difference? Here and here, as in the 1856 lithograph. This image of Attucks thus resonates not quite with visual representations of Black rebellion and defense in the period, but with abolitionist propaganda that centered Black suffering under the lash of slavery and racism. You can think about Josiah Wedgwood's kneeling slave here. Even more directly, Nell's illustration cites this painting of the Battle of Bunker Hill by John Trumbull, where General Joseph Warren is figured as a Christic Pieta figure. Attucks, too, Nell suggests, deserves our patriotic pity and compassion. Nell's work on the colored patriots would become increasingly relevant as the nation hurtled towards a civil war. In 1858, he and a committee of activists and reformers established Crispus Attucks Day and began annual commemorations in Boston. These events were held annually through the end of the Civil War. The first commemoration doubled as a social protest of the Dred Scott decision, and in 1863, members of the 54th Massachusetts Colored Regiment were present at that year's exercises. Their presence made clear that the move to celebrate Attucks was part of a broader effort to bring Black soldiers into the Union effort and also to suggest that the time for nonviolent resistance was over. Wilson's ekphrastic portrait, it's so funny since there's no actual image, I keep wanting to go to the next slide to show you the portrait, so now I'm going to describe to you Wilson's word portrait. So Wilson's word portrait of Attucks in the picture gallery is thus part of a broader movement of Black memory work around him that was already happening in the 1850s. Wilson certainly read The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, as did the rest of his cohort. Lifting him out of the motley rabble of Revere's battle scene, Wilson's portrait instead seeks to ennoble Attucks in his individuality, representing him as a major hero of the Revolution, posed alive and sitting rather than lying prone, dead, or dying. So just to make this clear, I think it's significant that in Wilson's text, he gives us a portrait in which Attucks is very much alive, right? Not dead or dying. And in this way, Wilson challenged this whole kind of necro-political culture industry that had sprouted up around Attucks in the decades following his killing. Okay, so that's Attucks. And now we're going to get to our beloved Phyllis Wheatley. So finally we arrive at Wilson's word portrait of Wheatley. Ethiop's description of Wheatley's portrait is perhaps the most directly ekphrastic representation to appear in this series. You'll notice I have the bracketed E there. We talked about different spellings of Wheatley's name in Alexandria's presentation, and Wilson spelled her name W-H-E-A-T-L-Y without the E. So it's clear that Ethiop is describing some version of the famous frontispiece portrait that appeared at the beginning of the original publication of her book of poems. Wilson could have had this original engraving in mind, which of course was itself a copy, and probably engraved from a painting of Wheatley that some have attributed to the enslaved Boston artist Scipio Moorhead. Or Wilson's source may have been one of the many copies of the portrait that appeared in literary biographies and other print sources in the 1850s. In fact, in 1855, just 3 years before the picture gallery appeared, 3 separate publications reproduced Wheatley's portrait. So this was like a rich time for reproduction of Wheatley's image. Another possible source text is Margaretta Matilda Odell's 1834 memoir of Wheatley, which included a portrait styled after the 1773 frontispiece, and which you can see here on the right side of the screen. Odell's memoir is shot through with the biases of family interest and the possessiveness of a Wheatley descendant, and in this way, it reproduces a fundamental violence of Wheatley's life. Does that make clear? She was a descendant of the Wheatley family, right? So the memoir reproduces a fundamental violence of Wheatley's life, in which she circulated as a coveted token of status for the Wheatley family and as a symbol of their supposed evangelical benevolence. Nonetheless, Odell's family member was an important source text for Black writers and readers seeking access to Wheatley's poems and information about her life. Acts of Black reading and revision of Odell's memoir also challenge a long history of white people beyond the Wheatley family laying claim to Wheatley and her verse, a greedy possessiveness that was often, ironically, authorized by liberal views and anti-slavery sympathies. Literary scholar Joanna Brooks expertly uncovered the forms of emotional labor and mourning work that Wheatley was compelled to perform for white elites in Boston, especially for white women. And Odell herself positions her unauthorized memoir as an abolitionist one, quote, dedicated to the friends of the Africans. Opposing efforts to keep Wheatley's legacy in poetry under the thumb of her enslavers long after her death, and that's one of the ironies and just the brutal things about this memoir, is that they continued to claim, the Wheatleys claimed her, like, after her death. This is in 1834, so this is generations later, right? So opposing that kind of effort, this like family claim to Wheatley, William J. Wilson wrests the poet from the grasp of the Wheatley family, instead placing her portrait in verse in intimate relation to other Black artists, art, and political actors in his gallery. This entry also highlights and honors Wheatley's own kinship connections in her life through an evocation of the loving image and imprint of Wheatley's mother, which Ethiop says never left Wheatley's memory. He writes, quote, stolen at the tender age of 7 years from the fond embraces of a mother whose image never once faded from her memory. In his actual description of the portrait, Ethiop emphasizes Wheatley's superior physiognomy through a language that echoes with taxonomies of comparative anatomy from the period. He writes, quote, the facial angle contains full 90 degrees, the forehead is finely formed, and the brain large. Wilson's portrait emphasizes Wheatley's intellectual capacity, as well as her adherence to traditional standards of beauty and femininity. Quote, to this may be added a small mouth, with lips prettily turned and a chin, that perfection of beauty in the female face, delicately tapered from a throat and neck that are of themselves perfection. Ultimately, Ethiop's description of a head of Phyllis Wheatley seeks to honor and sanctify the poet by taking her frontispiece portrait, an object from the print sphere. Oh, sorry, I'm going to slow down because this is also important. So he takes her portrait, right, an object from the print sphere, and he elevates it into a work of fine art. So Ethiop presents Wheatley's portrait to us as if it's an oil painting. So it's a kind of real act of sort of aesthetic elevation. But of course, this is an exercise that's marked by both ambiguity and irony, since the Afric-American Picture Gallery is not an actual museum of fine art, right? It is yet another text embedded in the print sphere, like Wheatley's frontispiece in her book of poems. So it's really interesting, these aesthetic experiments and turning these objects from the print sphere into works of fine art, but the text itself exists in the print sphere. Wilson's sketch of Wheatley doubles as a record of Wilson's own reading of Wheatley's poetry. It also suggests that Wilson's own ambitions as a poet were inspired by Wheatley. In fact, in the sketch, Wilson honors Wheatley's legacy with his own 7-line ode poem that opens with an enthusiastic apostrophe. So here I just want to make the argument that I think like Wilson, who also wrote poetry, was like in part like inspired by Wheatley. And so this is Wilson's own snippet of verse, his own poem addressed to Wheatley. I'll let you read it on your own, but in this poem, Wilson picks up on the many moments where Wheatley figures herself in flight, bemoaning the, quote, slavish chain that sought to check her soul's eagle flight. He also literally presents her here as his own poetic muse, calling her an angel of purity and writing that, quote, thy harp still hangs within our sight to cheer though thou art gone. So Wheatley here positions himself as a poetic descendant of Wheatley. He is also engaged in the kind of memorialization work of Wheatley that we learned about in Alexandria Russell's brilliant talk last semester. And I think it's amazing and also really moving that there is this strong line of memorialization around Wheatley, one that begins as early as with her death in the late 18th century, and that stretches nearly unbroken to our present. And there's one final tantalizing connection to be made between Wilson and Wheatley. I'm wondering if it's possible that in writing as Ethiop, Wilson was making another nod to Wheatley, who called herself Ethiop in poems like To the University of Cambridge in New England, her poem addressed to incoming students at Harvard. Okay, so I began my talk by framing Wilson as a quintessential Brooklynite. Oh wait, I don't want to show you this yet. That's a good reveal, so I'm going to leave that as a surprise for the end, and I'm wrapping up here. So I began my talk by framing Wilson as a quintessential Brooklynite, but I want to end with his departure from the city. During the Civil War, Wilson joined a group of African-American educators who moved south to teach former slaves and refugees in Union camps and makeshift towns. This group of migrating educators included the writer, activist, and fugitive intellectual Harriet Jacobs. Black New Yorkers who moved south during and after the Civil War made important contributions to the Freedmen's Bureau and to efforts led by African Americans on the ground. But their exodus also left something of a haunting absence in New York itself. And I've been really interested in tracking this kind of the people who stayed. I feel like our narratives about migration often focus on destinations rather than the places left. And for the people who stayed in New York, there was a kind of vacuum from these very vibrant educational and activist circles, and you can feel grief actually in the account after people leave. So the Civil War would indeed radically transform the landscape of Black activism and politics in places like Brooklyn. The war also transformed the terrain of Black creativity and expression as political priorities shifted in a very real way from aesthetics to war. The outbreak of the war was certainly an impetus for Wilson's migration down south, but there were other factors in play. New York was notorious for its anti-Blackness, and as Jonathan Wells has written about in his book, The Kidnapping Club, it was considered by many to be the most racist city north of the Mason-Dixon line. Wilson's own career as an educator was deeply marked by anti-Black violence and harassment. In 1863, he reported to the Board of Education that his school faced constant vandalism and mobbing from antagonistic white residents who did not want a Black school in his neighborhood. White youth and adults threw stones into the school's windows at night, and on their way to school, students were harassed, bullied, and even beaten. There's one especially painful moment where Wilson talks about children having their school books beaten out of their hands, like slapped out of their arms. As a result of these incidents, attendance at Wilson's school dwindled. Many parents kept their children at home because they didn't feel safe sending their children to a school constantly being attacked by white people. Other parents pulled their children out of colored school number 1 and sent them elsewhere. So that's kind of another backdrop for Wilson's migration out of the city. Given his interest in being at the center of both culture and politics, it's perhaps no surprise that by 1865, Wilson had moved with Mary and Annie to D.C., the seat of federal power and the heart of formal Black politics in the Reconstruction era. He would join many of the nation's most prominent African-American leaders and activists, including Frederick Douglass. I've also found this letter, which I could talk a lot about, but I will restrain myself, this letter in the Tennessee State University archives, which suggests that Wilson did at least one teaching stint in the South earlier in 1863, writing his father from Freedom, Tennessee, just 2.5 weeks after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Wilson does not say anything about the coming of freedom, nor about his hopes for the new year, but relates a harrowing experience of a relapsed illness. After moving permanently to D.C. in 1865, Wilson opened up a school for formerly enslaved youth. He was a member of a committee that sought to memorialize Lincoln after his assassination. He was also a founding trustee of Howard University. An article that ran in the New National Era in 1873 suggests that Wilson left D.C. with some frequency to teach recently emancipated people across the South. Wilson also continued to make contributions to Black periodicals after the war. literary scholar Benjamin Fagan has recently uncovered Wilson's contributions to Douglass's new national era, where he wrote columns not as Ethiop anymore, but under a new pen name. I think you're going to love his pen name. Are you ready for it? He wrote as Old Boy in Specs. Isn't that great? And here's one final fascinating detail about Wilson in his own personal Reconstruction era. He was appointed cashier of the Freedmen's Bank after its headquarters moved from New York to D.C., a position that befitted a man who believed the liberation of the race could not happen without complete economic autonomy. Established as a safe place for former slaves and black soldiers to deposit their wages for savings, the bank would ultimately fall victim to predation and corruption by white bankers and speculators, leading to its collapse in 1874. And some families actually spent the next 30 years trying to recover their deposits from the U.S. government. In Black Reconstruction, Du Bois said that the story of the Freedmen's Bank was so disgraceful and shameful, it was, quote, a chapter in American history which most Americans naturally prefer to forget. But before the Freedmen Bank's catastrophic collapse, an article in the New National Era finds Wilson proudly seated in his bank. The piece reinforces once again Wilson's flair for opulence and his interest in the production of spaces that showed off black wealth, respectability, and power. One wonders even if Wilson himself may have been the author of this piece, especially since it is structured as a virtual tour of his office at the Freedmen's Bank, and thus bears an uncanny resemblance to Ethiop's tour of the picture gallery. So I just want to leave you with this image, or this word portrait of Wilson, happily seated in his bank, because honestly, I think he would like it, and also because it's another word portrait that we might imaginatively hang on the walls of the picture gallery. Thank you.
Well, I really have just nothing but praise first. I'm just so thrilled that you've modeled the kind of close reading and extended analysis that Wilson himself has in creating a text for us that gives us a sense of what it was like to read it. I'd love to talk to you offline about the slave ship, the connection to the Turner, its connection to Cambridge and to Harvard, the ownership by actually a classmate of Du Bois's, Lothrop, the descendant who gave it to the MFA, could speak more about that. But I wonder, for the sake of this conversation, if you might speak more about what it means that the first museum of African-American art in the United States was effectively a reading exercise. What it tells us about the nature of vision in the United States. So that's one question.
Yeah. That's a really great. Wait, Damaris, do you want to answer it? I saw you nodding.
Hold on, get the mic.
Yeah.
A bit about how we define seeing and sighting.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think for so long, I've been working on this project for quite a while, almost 10 years, and it's a project that, like, sort of, I don't know if this has happened for folks who write, but I just find that, like, the seed for my next book is always in the former book. So when I was finishing up Fugitive Science, I think I talk about this text for like a paragraph or two, and I just kept trying to wedge Wilson into that project. The only connection to be made between Fugitive Science and the picture gallery, I think, is that when he describes Wheatley, he uses this language of comparative anatomy. So that's the only connection I could make, but I just thought the text was so fascinating. So I just felt like I wanted to keep thinking about it. And it's just, I've spent, so much of the research has been done in isolation during the pandemic. And I've presented to some reading groups, but this is my first time doing a formal presentation. And I have to be honest that for so long, I've been really obsessed with tracking down the sources. trying to figure out, because there are some objects in the gallery that clearly have a direct reference, right? And the Wheatley example is the most clear one, but there are some other objects in the gallery that I assumed were just imagined by Wilson, and as I started to do more research, I realized, oh, there actually is an existing referent. And they're usually not works of fine art. They're frontispieces, they're engravings, they're printed illustrations. There's one object called Sunrise. There's a sunset, a Nigerian sunset, that I ended up finding a missionary text that's called Sunrise in the Tropics. So he was clearly he was making some kind of revision. He was anti-immigration, and he was citing this pro-immigration text saying, well, mine is a sunrise, or a sunset, not a sunrise. So that's just to say, a lot of my initial research was focused on the objects. While I was preparing this presentation, I started thinking more about Black viewers and thinking about that pamphlet I showed you from J.P. Ball. All of a sudden something clicked, and I was like, oh, it matters that he's a Black writer, that he imagines that there are some Black visitors to the gallery space. And so now I need to think more about this question, the fact that it's not just significant that he's imagining something like a museum of Black art, but that he's imagining it as a Black space with Black viewers. And I want to think more about what that means for the perspectives that he gives, the kind of the politics of visuality and visual representation. That's just to say, I'm on it, but I don't think I'm there yet.
Can I add one more piece of context here?
Please.
No.
No? Oh, no. If he says no, it's a no. But if you'll grant me a yes, I'll just continue. So when I mentioned that, I feel so strongly that this is meant to be your project, and connected it to the Du Bois 1900 Paris exposition. It was for this reason. So if we define that as the first landmark exhibition about African-American photography, right, in the United States, he has 363 photographs in the exhibition. He doesn't give the title or the artist's name. We now know, thanks to Deborah Willis' scholarship, that it was Thomas Askew's photographs. But he sets them out and installs them surrounded by books.
Yes, that's right.
So it's a reading exercise, in effect. Yes,
absolutely.
Right? He doesn't lead you in to say, just view these only. It's read these. It seems to me that with this book project, what an argument that also can be made is we actually have another example of the importance of this merger between reading and the retinal mind to define what racial sight required, in the United States. So that's more what I was.
I love that. That's wonderful. Thank you. Well, I had a slide that was that exhibition space of the Paris Exposition, the American Negro exhibit at the Paris Exposition, which is what Sarah's talking about. And Daniel Murray included 300 works of literature alongside the statuette of Frederick Douglass, the Du Bois infographic. So I've been thinking about, I will also say I was a little embarrassed how long it took me to make the connection between the picture gallery and that space, right? Which is itself another kind of picture gallery. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. What is you said you're writing a biography of Wilson?
No. Oh, God. No. I'll leave that to you.
What are you writing?
Oh, so... what am I writing? I'm trained as a literary critic. I teach in a Black Studies department. My writing is very interdisciplinary, so I do a lot of work in the intersections of literary studies, visual culture, and science studies. So when I started this, and my first book is kind of wild and it's not traditional literary criticism. So when I started this book, I was like, this is going to be my real work in literary studies. But I think what often happens with the archives that we work on, I couldn't just make it a project about literature. It was a project about so many other things. It's about reading and about art and about politics. So it's going to have, I'm trying to include as much biographical information about Wilson as I can based on my research. It would be amazing if someone could do a full biography of him. I don't know if right now I have enough information to do that. But I'm increasingly thinking about the book itself as providing, the full text. So there's going to be a set of appendices that have a full annotated edition of the text, so people can use it for teaching, for research. some other appendices with some of Wilson's other writings. And then I have I have a chapter that's about Wheatley in relation to Wilson. I didn't talk about it here, but a whole other aspect of this project is about how Wilson anticipates the theories of Walter Benjamin, but specifically thinking about the politics of race and the image in a world of consumer capitalism, and specifically thinking about the politics of the image vis-a-vis racial capitalism. So those are two of the chapters. But increasingly, I've been thinking about maybe the book is in part its own exhibition calendar. It's an exhibition catalog for this work that didn't get to reproduce images. Does that make sense? So I've been trying to think about building out like a visual archive for each of the objects, in part because that's something, so I'm hoping it's going to be a beautiful, glossy book with lots of nice images, since that's something that wasn't possible for Wilson in his own time.
But do you have enough of his writings to make a volume, or
what
just
do you think?
His collected essays?
Yeah, that's a good.
Did he
that's a
publish
good
24
question.
or 50?
That's a good question. I think I have, just for myself, been compiling all of his periodical correspondence.
Right.
And I think that if that together with the other pieces, it absolutely would be an amazing volume.
Yeah, well, you should do that.
You think I should do that after I finish the book?
Yeah, or before, whatever.
Okay,
No, we have a
part
series
of it is just trying to figure out what this should be and what it should look like.
Well, we have a series at Oxford which collects uncollected essays of Black thinkers, like James McCune Smith had never been collected before.
Right. I love that.
And he
volume.
wrote all the time.
Yeah.
So I had John Stauffer collect.
I love
and
that collection.
We did 2 others, but you might think about that.
That's
We could
great.
talk about that.
Okay.
I think it would be very important.
Great.
I want all these people to be remembered and have their book.
Yeah.
And when people say, "Well, it's online," and who's going to do 50 searches and read all? Nobody's going to do that.
Yeah.
I'm not going to do that. I'm
and
too
it's
old to
true
do
for
that.
people who wrote in periodicals. Part of it is just it takes a lot of time to search and to bring them together. So it's valuable when all of that stuff is brought together in one volume.
Hit me with a proposal.
Okay, cool. All right, sounds good.
Hi, curator.
This isn't your phone.
Well, the unseen truth.
This isn't your phone, is it?
But I'm going to send you a note about that because I thought of something.
Okay, I'd love to hear.
All right.
Yeah, hi, Britt.
Hi.
Thank you for that very intriguing presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I don't know if you have time or space, because this question is very connected to the others, but slightly different.
Yeah.
Considering the intersections between commodified bodies, Black culture, and technologies, both industrial and artistic, what are your speculations about why Wilson was resisting the influence of pseudo-photographic or photographic archives and more moving towards the embracing of a classical art and elevating these art forms? And when you finish with that question, what are your considerations about these types of literary portraitures in connection with the slave narrative tradition and the ways that it is rooted in this capitalist economy?
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Damaris. I love a red question. It's great. Okay, let me answer the second one first. I talked about it a little bit at the beginning, but I do think, this, in the broader book, I am really interested in this thing I'm calling late antebellum Black aesthetics. I just think it's such, this is the rise of the novel in the 1850s. We're seeing Black writing getting more novelistic in this moment, and I also think just more experimental in a way that I've just been trying to figure out by studying very carefully the writings of this particular coterie. So I talked about James McCune Smith for only a minute, but a lot of the periodical correspondence is a series of James McCune Smith and William J. Wilson writing back and forth to one another. And they have a kind of playful and then sometimes cantankerous kind of exchange. But they're the exchange itself is really fascinating historically, and I think aesthetically it's also so interesting. Just, you know, McCune Smith is like dropping in all these references to like Latin and Greek, and there's like this kind of rhetorical acrobatics, and I think it's so interesting that Black writing is getting so experimental and interesting in this moment right before the Civil War. And then the Civil War starts, and then everyone's like off to something else, right? There's a real interesting, the war kind of forecloses these aesthetic possibilities that were happening. And sometimes there's just like a kind of mental exercise that I've been doing where I've been thinking about, well, I wonder what Black writing would have looked like during the early 1860s if the Civil War hadn't happened.
But Douglas wrote his photography essays during the war.
During the war. Well,
Right.
this isn't, okay, I also talk about this in the book. What about then the writing that's happening during the war is also super fascinating, because some people stop and some people don't.
Have you ever thought of comparing McCune Smith's the heads of Negroes
Yes.
with the picture gallery?
Yes. So
Tell them what
this
the heads
is so
of the
great,
Negroes.
because this is all the stuff I had to cut out of my talk. So in 1854, James McCune Smith publishes The Heads of the Colored People, which is another work that's basically his word portraits. And McCune Smith,
which Douglas thought was weird. I mean, it's written in a postmodern way, 100 years
so
before
interesting.
postmodernism, right?
and it's so interesting when Douglas includes stuff that he also critiques, right?
Yeah.
So it appears in his
Well,
paper.
he was his best friend. He goes, "This is my
but he
best friend,
hated
but I think this sucks." You know, like
yeah, and Douglas also really, James McCune Smith really imagined himself as being an advocate for like Black workers and the working class. And one of the things that Douglas didn't like about it was that James McCune Smith was kind of willing to go there with a certain discourse that wasn't concerned with respectability. He would talk about sex. He would talk about like kind of like interested in sort of like just kind of like laying it all out there. And I think that made Douglas nervous.
James McCune Smith was the best educated African-American of his time. He had 3 degrees from the University of Glasgow, including a medical degree. And Douglas chose him to write the introduction to his second slave narrative, replacing the white authenticators from his 1845 narrative with James McCune Smith. And he thought, he worshipped McCune Smith and envied him in a good way.
Yes.
For his education and his friendship. But ironically, McCune Smith, who was mixed race, married a white woman, and his descendants passed. And a lot of them did not know that their great-great-grandfather was Black until we had a book event for the collected writings of James McCune Smith at the New York Historical Society upon the publication of John's book.
Wow.
And these white people came in and they just said, we had no idea, or maybe they found out recently or in the advertising, and, you know. Isn't that wild?
It's wild. It's
Yeah.
really wild.
And it's sad, I mean, passing is, I don't want to reduce passing to a sentence, but, because it's very complicated. Some people think it's a revolutionary critique of the fixity or the essentialization of race. And the people who pass are saying, screw you, to people who think races are fixed and immutable, right? So I'm too old to go with that, but you know, I find that interesting.
Yeah.
But one of the blackest people at the middle of the 19th century has descendants who, you know, didn't even know he was Black. Only in America, so.
And I think even in literary studies, James McCune Smith is one of those figures who deserves more attention and recognition, you know? And because his writing, I mean, it is the fate of so many writers who published in periodicals, right? In these ephemeral publications that are spread out across years rather than having published a book. I think John says that in his volume, that perhaps part of like McCune Smith's sort of like historical, you know, the fact that he's not given more recognition may be tied to the fact that he never published a book.
Yes.
That he never published a bound book. And so I find that actually really compelling. And I think that might be a way to understand Wilson too. He wrote a ton, but he never actually published a book.
If you write me and say, oh, I wish John Stauffer's collection of essays by James McCune Smith is a paperback, so I could use it in my big lecture course. That's 500.
You know, I do teach those.
Yeah. And I can get it in the paperback.
Yeah, all right, I will do that.
A big favor.
Yeah.
You know the 2 pictures with the Virgil epigraph from the African-American, including the Alexander Dumas, and need you to send me one. One of those is that I can send to a scholar in Cambridge who's writing a book on Memnon. You know, Memnon was black in ancient, and you see he's got that.
Yeah,
black
from
Memnon
Virgil.
right there.
Yeah.
But I want to send it to Paul Cartledge,
Okay.
who trained Emily Greenwood, because he's writing in our Yale series called Black Lives. You can write about a real person or a fictional character. So we have a manuscript on Jim, and we commissioned one on Memnon, because so many people don't realize that Memnon was represented as an Ethiopian in ancient Greek. But I want to send him that because I'm sure he's never seen that.
Cool. Okay, I will.
Okay,
Thank
thank
you. Yeah, of course.
Okay, good.
Oh, me, I'm so scared of your question. Okay, I'm ready.
I don't know why.
You know so much.
I don't know anything. Though now I'm scared to ask my question. I was just going to say what a real treat it was, first of all, to see so many of the texts that I've engaged with and the visual culture that I teach. All of those Crispus Attucus images are part of a lecture that I really love to give. And just to find a kindred spirit who also thinks the 19th century is cool. I spend so much of my time trying to convince my students interested in Black art and representation that it's more than contemporary art is cool. Like the 19th century is where it's at. And in doing so, their questions are always like, can we talk about Afrofuturism today? And my whole thing is, no, it's like the Afro past is just as cool. And here, I think what I really find amazing about this text in particular, but I think it's representative of other 19th century members of this circle, right, is the way in which the speculative is really is very much like part of this 19th century, and I think you're right, part of this kind of late 19th century or mid to late 19th century moment. And this text specifically, I think it was so prescient and is so useful to us because it is about recreating or imagining in words, both for Wilson himself and for the reader, right? An image, an object that doesn't exist. And so I want to think about both of those edges of this text, right? In sort of creating the first African-American museum in words, right? With no visual content. Wilson is building a world out of words that there functionally weren't the resources to build. Like he was building out of words something that people needed, that he wanted to experience, and that he might have experienced, in his own home or visiting the homes of other people who had collected objects. But he's creating that as an institution that
and bringing
exists
everything together. I just
only as a
imagine
text.
him getting these little glimpses on Broadway and in homes, and then bringing it all together. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And imagining a world for himself and for his peers, in which he could walk into a gallery and then experience something. I'm thinking about also the way that it imagines the conversations that we're having now about Black joy and about Black leisure and about being able to just like something because it's beautiful, even though there are all of these political edges in the work as well. But I think as folks, as we're thinking about the challenges of the archive, I discovered Black artists. I mean, I didn't really discover them. Who we had none of their works, but I've never learned about them. They're not in any.
Just read about them.
They're not in any textbooks. There's. I've never heard about them as a graduate student, but I know they existed because I found their photographic portraits in an album at Howard, and I have a description of a panorama that they did, and that's it. I know where it was shown. We don't know what it looked like. There's no evidence of existence whatsoever other than those kinds of textual documents. So I'm thinking about how this also gives us I don't know, this isn't really a question, but how it also I think anticipates the moment that we're in now, where there are so many objects that have been lost, right? And how do we wrestle with their significance and kind of critically engaging with them and presenting them when we can't show them. And so I'm just gonna leave you to make some sense of that.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, I'm also thinking about, also coming across artists where it's like there's like a notice in a magazine or it is a kind of haunting feeling to come across like artists, and then you go do a Google search, no results, right? So what it means to put together maybe not just a speculative, it's just making me think about that already, like in the field of art history, Black art, of African-American art history in the 19th century. It's like also a speculative history in a way, right? And it also sounds like it's often has to be textual. Sometimes it can't be visual because those objects have been lost. That's
or
really...
like the portrait of Wilson that we know
that, it has to exist,
right?
Yeah.
We know that they had their pictures taken.
Yeah.
But where are they? They are lost to us.
Right.
So.
And all of the daguerreotypes that, I mean, I need to talk to Skip more about this and to Sarah, people who know more, and just that there are so many, but who are these people, right? Just the fact that they're not labeled.
It tells me every year when I look at the Swan Gallery auction of Afro-Americana in February. I mean, that's where I bought the Bond Woman's Narrative manuscript, for example. They're photo albums. They're photo albums, family photo albums,
Right.
with nobody identified.
Right.
And it's a gold mine for somebody. You know, if we could only do genealogy from descent, right? I mean, forward, and connect you to this gold mine of pictures, and they, it's like the tomb of the unknown soldier.
Yeah,
the
it's wild.
tomb of the unknown, a museum of unknown subjects,
Yeah,
waiting to be
absolutely.
discovered.
I think both in this text, though, and in these boxes of photographs of unnamed people, there's a kind of grief, maybe, for
Absolutely.
the institutions that don't exist,
Yes.
for the history that has been lost to us.
Yes.
When I've found those pictures where those artists are identified, I also encountered literally boxes of family photographs, some of which had deteriorated to the point where it was like a ghost of a person in the image. And yes, I think it would be cool if we could trace genealogy from photographs. But I think that one of the things that I work with students, we have to figure out a way to write about this archive to engage with it. And I think there is a kind of it's about emotions and about grief, and that's somewhere in the undercurrent in this text.
I've been thinking about Greg's work too, or about the Zealy daguerreotypes, and just this assumption that we don't know who these people are, but it's actually that should just be the beginning. It's maybe we could try to figure out who these people are, right? So I mean, I think there's a lot more work to be done. I did not forget about the first part of your question, Damaris. And can I also just say one more thing? The text is so speculative in these moments too, where Wilson is always saying, I mean, right? He's very playful. He's always talking about this museum to come, and he says to the reader, you can write your own. We want to hear your own contributions. And he frames it as if he wants people to send in works of art, but he's of course encouraging readers to submit their own writing to the Anglo-African magazine. Does that make sense? So he gives us, but there's a really haunting image where he asks us to imagine the picture gallery as having all of these empty spaces, with the idea that the reader could imagine their own work on the wall or in that space. But in the mind's eye, you imagine it's haunting, right? To think about these blank spaces, and that might be a place to think about the losses of the archive, and to think about grief there as well. Thank you. Yeah, can I say to Damaris, I hadn't thought about the possibility that the text is resisting photography. I had just thought, oh, it's just, Benjamin says that when there's a new visual technology, there's a period where it can't be expressed, and so people always understand it through through an already existing art form. So in this period, it's a transitional moment where the photograph is talked about as if it's a painting. So that's how I've been thinking about it. It's it's everywhere, but but I hadn't thought yet about the willful resistance to photography, and that reminds me of our favorite scrapbooks held at the Library Company of Philadelphia. These amazing African-American women's scrapbooks and friendship albums from the 1830s, 1840s. Jasmine Nicole Cobb has talked about how those scrapbooks, often there's a kind of resistance to the visualization of Black women's bodies, and that's how she reads like Sarah Mapps Douglas's Butterfly. That she sees it that these art forms were also sometimes refusing like racist taxonomies, objectification of the Black body. So that the idea of maybe there's a resistance to photography is very interesting. Thank you.
And a spiritual destabilization and temperance. There were a lot
Yes.
of people at the time that felt if you took their picture,
Yes.
that you were taking pieces of their soul. And considering how connected Wilson's work is to the dead and other aspects that you're talking about that overlap with African notions of spirituality and indigenous notions of spirituality, there might have been a significant resistance.
That's very interesting.
Photography there.
I mean, I always think about him as being part of this coterie. They're just like, kind of like, some of them pretty like secular and really invested in like the future, new technologies, but there's certainly perhaps a kind of something happening there around the fears or some kinds of worries about the technology itself. Thank you for that. It's on.
Okay. Hi, Britt.
Hi.
This is a wonderful presentation. So, I mean, I have a couple of questions. The first one was a version of...
Excuse me. Sorry, I was wrong.
Oh, it's not on?
Oh, it was on. I turned it off. The first one is a kind of version of Nina's question, which is about, thinking about the multiple meanings of picture and picture as this almost kind of command or imperative to visualize and to speculate. And so my question was, might we see this as kind of a precursor to more contemporary forms of Black speculative fiction? It seems like the quick answer might be yes.
It is. The answer is yes.
And then my second question was more about how he theorizes or writes about the practice of rambling. And so, sort of expanding upon this, observation or commentary about Black leisure and joy, right? Particularly when compared to a concept like loitering, which I think is kind of a criminalization of wandering. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to either of those questions.
I'm going to speak to both of them at once. Yes, it looks forward to more contemporary genealogies of speculative fiction. I didn't get to talk about this like grand detour of the picture gallery itself. I talked about the first part of the text that's like presented of like, here we are in front of this object and now let's move here. And so it's like very contained, which is like sort of against the spirit of Wilson's interest in like strolling and moving freely, right? And I think that part of the picture gallery is really interesting because in other places he's talking all the time about being on Broadway, seeing the sights, and it's like a kind of panoramic view. But then once we get in the gallery, that's where we get these kind of. So the text starts as a gallery tour, but then something wild happens. There's one day the gallery's assistant comes in with this painting, this landscape painting of a place called the Black Forest, which is a reference to the Black Forest in the fairy tale tradition. But it seems like in the picture gallery, the Black Forest is located in a geography of freedom, as in Canada, that it's in Canada. And so this very wild thing happens in the middle of the text, and I have a chapter on this. He basically, in the next installment, Ethiop falls asleep, and I think he kind of like transports himself through the portal of this landscape painting and ends up in the Black Forest. So that's like a really interesting moment of the text kind of like opening up in terms of like from this kind of like contained space to unfettered movement. And then in the Black Forest, he visits this Black artist who's been living and working in exile. His name is Bernice. And Bernice takes Ethiop to his cave gallery. So this is you see how wild this text is. Takes him into this mountain to his cave gallery, And the cave gallery seems to include reproductions of works of art that actually exist that also exist in the picture gallery. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So there's this doubled gallery within the speculative fiction.
I wonder what he was smoking.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. He was a bohemian. Like that's what I think is so interesting. There's this moment in the late 1850s.
We underestimate the complexity of black people 150 years ago because they were just complex.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
And in that case, more complex.
We're going to do one more question? Oh, yeah, the doubling, absolutely.
Last question.
Okay, last question. Yes.
Okay, yeah, I'll try and be quick.
Yeah, and then we're
Great
going to
paper. So just a quick comment on the kind of why a kind of word picture. And I think one thing worth thinking about is clearly resources, but also institutionalization, right? So if you don't have the resources, I mean, it costs to get particular, fine art is expensive. It even costs just to reproduce illustrations, right? And I think towards the latter end of the 19th century into the 20th century, it becomes much cheaper to produce. There's this kind of magazine revolution. There's a lot of books about it. So I wonder if there's just a kind of cost issue. And then I was thinking also about when you're trying to create a tradition that doesn't exist, right? So that there are people right through into like the early 20th century who aren't institutionalized, who want to write about black history. J.A. Rogers is one, and he says, sadly, I almost kind of got an education in Chicago. Du Bois is one of the few people who has the kind of credentials to do that and has that education. But I think there's something interesting there about working outside of an institution and not having funding, which perhaps forces you to do it imaginatively. So that was my kind of comment. But my real question is about, I was fascinated by the term Afric-American and all these different terms. So it's just there's three and now a fourth one, Memnon. Anglo-African magazine, so that's one. There's Afric, which I think Shakespeare uses in Troilus and Cressida.
Oh, interesting.
And I think is Old English. It probably goes back to about the 15th century. And then there's Ethiop, which is an ancient Greek word for Africa, broadly speaking, which Shakespeare uses much more often than Afric. I think he only uses Afric once. I think Ethiop he uses like 8 or 9 times. So I was just curious, why Afric? Do you know? And have you thought about all these different? I get obsessed with these.
Yeah, no, this is great.
Terms people use.
You're gonna like my book. It's great when questions speak to. Well, in my forthcoming book. So I think that this is an interesting. There's also experimentation going on in this moment around racial nomenclatures. So that's part of what I've been thinking about. And so you've got Anglo-African magazine, right, which is an interesting racial nomenclature. And then Wilson shows up. I got something different. I'm going with Afric-American, right? And they're all they're in dialogue, so you almost wonder if this is like Wilson's rejoinder or response to the Anglo-African, right? So there's Anglo-African, there's Ethiop, I had not thought about the Shakespeare connection. That's very interesting because all of these, they all read Shakespeare, they were also in that network with Ira Eldridge, right? So that's very helpful. There was one other thing that I wanted to say about the racial nomenclature. Oh, Afric-American, the one place that I have found it is in the proceedings of the colored conventions and in the proceedings of this group of activists who were fighting for the extension of the franchise in New York. I found that term. So it's being used by that group, but it's definitely not like a dominant usage, and I see it as being part of this terrain of experimentation.
It goes back to the 1830. 1831, in the pages of The Liberator, there's a debate, people writing in between I only know this because of independent historian Dorothy Sterling. She has a paperback book, and one of the little chapters is called The Namestakes. And I have a chapter on this in my new book. And it's because it was a lecture I gave every year in the intro to Afro. So I would tell the students, I would cite these letters to the editor with black people arguing with each other about what the race should be called. And you're thinking of William Whipper in 1833 at the Color Convention. Says that the word Africa should be chiseled off every institution that black people created, like the African Methodist Episcopal Church, because it was alienating. The colored was somehow thought to be more conducive to integration. And Afric-American, one person says we should be Afric-American. The next week, somebody writes in and says, Afric-American is the ugliest word I ever heard in my whole life.
Do you think it was pronounced Afric-American?
Yeah, A-F-R-I-C, Afric-American. But fused together.
Yeah.
James Weldon Johnson, 100 years later almost, would say Afro-American as one word. But anyway, between 1831 and 1845, there's this big debate. And I would always end with Henry Highland Garnett and say, all you Negroes get a life. None of these names are going to free the race, you know, and who cares what we call each other?
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, you did a fabulous job.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Wonderful.